Get started. I'd like to welcome everyone to the Regional Stormwater Partnership of the Carolinas, our first Tech Talk of the year, our first virtual Tech Talk of the year. I think we got between 130 and 140 people registered for today's meeting. That's great. I think that's a record for us. I think in the past we may have had 60 at most. So this is great. I see we got a cross section of people from across North Carolina, from the Raleigh region and from the mountain areas. Also got NCDOT, colleges and university, engineering consultants, state government, like I say, the mountain region, and also from people from the great state of South Carolina, even from their state government and colleges and local governments, even to our neighbors to the south of us in the Lancaster County. So I'd like to welcome everyone to this meeting, and it should be a great meeting, especially with all the rain we've had here recently and the flooding. So I'll turn that over to the presenters.
Hi, I'm David Caldwell. I'm with the Regional Stormwater Partnership, also a member of Mecklenburg County Stormwater Services. I'd also like to welcome you today to the Tech Talk, and I'm really excited to hear what these folks have to say. And like Chris said, we have a really great participation for this today and a lot of interest. I'd also, while I'm thinking about it, I also want to thank Rising Solutions, Regina and Carrie, for their work with the partnership, for helping to pull this off. The format for today, you may notice that the audience will not be able to use audio or video, but if you have questions, we do want you to type those into the Q&A at the bottom, not the chat, but if you have questions, you can put them in the Q&A, and then at the end of the presentation, we're going to try to work through those. A lot of you submitted questions earlier with your registration, and the presenters went through those questions, and some of those will probably be answered throughout the presentation, but if they're not, feel free to type them in the Q&A throughout the presentation. You can do that. I also will remind the speakers to, if you're not speaking, if you'll stay muted, just so we can try to keep the quality of our audio good. So I'm just going to real fast kind of go through the bios and tell you a little bit about the speakers today that we have. We have 6 speakers that are going to talk about economical flood sensor deployment for flood monitoring, which is a really timely topic, I think. And like I said, we have a lot of interest in this right now. But I counted up, looking at the bios, I looked, and there's actually about over 90 years, 90 years of experience in these 6 speakers. So a lot of expertise here. So I think it'll be interesting. But so let me tell you a little bit about the speakers today. David Craning is going to lead it off. He's a lead project manager for Charlotte-Mecklenburg Stormwater Services. David has about 30 years of experience working on both water quality and flood mitigation projects in North Carolina. He's been involved in TMDL development, CIP project development, and flood mitigation planning and implementation. And he's currently focused on the integration of low-cost flood sensors with flood risk tools to enable better flood response and post-flood recovery. And then we'll hear from Ryan Spidell, environmental supervisor with Charlotte-Mecklenburg Stormwater Services, and he's been with us since 2012, and he manages a team of 6 employees that are responsible for maintaining and repairing 33 real-time water quality monitoring devices, 79 low-cost flood sensors, 5 creek cameras, and he also manages the county's illicit discharge and detection and elimination program. And then we'll hear from Matthew Storish, who's been with us since 2017. He conducts industrial and municipal stormwater inspections, and he manages the county's continuous monitoring and alert notification network. The past 2 years, he's overseen the implementation and maintenance of the low-cost flood sensor network. as part of a flood apex program with the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. And then Josh McSwain, we'll hear from after that, who's a project manager with Charlotte-Mecklenburg Stormwater Services. He has a bachelor's degree in geography and earth science from University of North Carolina at Charlotte. And in his current position, he manages one of the country's largest and most dense flood information and notification system networks, which we call FINS. And FINS includes 200 real-time automated monitoring gauges and is a cooperative partner with the Charlotte USGS office that maintains the field equipment. He's responsible for ensuring FINS is monitored 24 hours a day and 7 days a week, and manages the on-call team of 12 members who monitor flood warnings issued to first responders, and serves as an available resource in emergency situations. In addition to FINS, he's actively involved with hydrologic professionals across the United States and served on the board of directors for the National Hydrologic Warning Council for 10 years and was also the vice president for 3 years. And then after that, we'll hear from James Scanlon, who's a GIS analyst with Mecklenburg Stormwater Services. He's been with the county since 2013, providing geospatial and technical analysis for planning projects and public communication efforts related to flood hazard mapping, risk assessment, and mitigation efforts, as well as supporting the water quality CIP, MPDES, and volunteer programs. Overall, James has over 10 years of combined public and private sector experience working on numerous projects at the federal, state, and local levels. And James holds a bachelor's degree in environmental policy and planning from Virginia Tech. And then lastly, we'll hear from Neil Banjerji, who is the Water Resources Department Manager for ESP in the Charlotte region. And he has over 25 years of experience in water resources engineering and GIS, supporting a wide variety of projects and clients. His experience includes integration of forecast observed rainfall and stream data in support of storm event precipitation and response, and development of real-time warning mapping systems for state agencies and municipalities in the Carolinas and Virginia. And he holds a master's degree in civil engineering from the University of North Carolina at Charlotte and a bachelor's degree in civil engineering and anthropology from the University of Illinois. So that's a little bit about all the speakers today. So next, I'm gonna hand it over to David Craning to get this thing started and hear from what all you folks are here to hear about today. Thank you.
Good morning. Thanks, David, for introducing our speakers and the things that we have going. We did want to say we welcome you with the Regional Stormwater Partnership with the Carolinas, and let you know that the partnership is a nonprofit made up of municipal agencies and county agencies to come together at a mission to seek to educate and bring awareness to the public, businesses, and education centers of our region about stormwater issues and their impact on water quality in our environment. We further aim to unite local stormwater programs by sharing information and ideas in order to discuss and address similar stormwater issues on a regional level. And with that mission in mind, we appreciate your joining us today for this Tech Talk. Thanks, David.
Good morning. I'm David Craning, and I'm a lead project manager with Charlotte-Mecklenburg Stormwater Services. And I'm here today to talk with you about flood sensor deployment for flood monitoring and response. You're going to see this slide periodically throughout the presentation, just as kind of a waypoint with regard to what section of the talk we're on. I'm going to start off with an overview of really the project as a whole, turn it over to Ryan Spidell and Matthew Storosh. They're going to go into detail about low-cost sensor technology and deployment in our urban environment. Then Josh McSwain is going to talk about low-cost sensor communication. Essentially, how do we get that data from the field into an application where we can utilize it and provide actionable intelligence to our emergency responders. And then we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of the technical side of things and talk about flood inundation mapping and how we think we're going to be able to use that for flood monitoring and response. So we're going to just dive right in, and I want to mention that this is really about, we're talking about the flood world, not necessarily the water quality world. If there's any questions or we use any acronyms that you don't understand, please do go ahead and get those in the chat, enter those into the chat section, and we can do our best to make sure that it's that's clarified what we're talking about. And if you have the question, most likely somebody else does as well. All right, so let's dive into the project here. So what we're going to be talking about today is essentially a partnership between the Department of Homeland Security, Science and Technology Directorate, and Charlotte-Mecklenburg. So why was Charlotte-Mecklenburg, why did we make a good partner for DHS? Well, over the years, we've developed the BIN system, which is a very mature flood warning system. As mentioned during Josh McSwain's bio, we work closely with the USGS, and we have for many years taken information from the USGS, used a computer system to test that data and compare it against warning and alert levels, and then provide communication to our emergency responders about what's going on and where. So a lot of the sensors that we have out in the environment are managed by and installed by the USGS, and that's a very mature system. We've been using it for many years, and it works. It provides reliable information, and our emergency responders are very comfortable with it, and the system has really helped us to work very closely with our emergency responders to get them where they need to be. Additionally, we have a significant organizational capacity within our water quality group to deploy, test, and maintain low-cost sensors. Low-cost sensors, they're devices that are sitting out in our field, in the environment, and if you set it and forget it, they're not going to work for long. But thankfully, we had within our water quality group, and today Ryan and Matthew are going to be talking from that group, but we had a long history of deployment of water quality sensors through the C-MAN network, through deployment of that, maintenance of that equipment, and processing of the information that was coming in from those sensors. So we had a significant organizational capacity that really allowed us to, with confidence, say that we can deploy and take care of, because maintenance is critical to these devices. Additionally, we had a very detailed inventory of our flood-prone structures. Over the years, we've invested significant funds into the survey of flood-prone structures in Mecklenburg County. We have reliable information about things like living space elevation, parking space elevation, when will floodwaters touch a building, even down to things like mechanical equipment. We know when, at what elevation floodwaters are going to intersect these components of our built environment that is located in the floodplain. We also have a proven application of flood risk scoring approach and tool. That was one of the first in the nation where we approach our flood risk in a numerical way. We assign points, and we conduct mitigation based largely on those points. So we have a really good understanding of our flood risk, and then we have the data to back it up. And lastly is really the vision of our leadership, notably Dave Kanan and Tim Troutman, to understand how these mature systems could be taken, how we could take kind of the next step with these systems to really improve our ability to provide alerts, warnings to our emergency responders, and do a better job keeping our citizens safe. So it's really all of these components is what made us a good partner for DHS for this effort. I want to talk just briefly about some of the concepts that are really important for you to understand. Now, these concepts are going to be gone into with much more detail later in the talk, but it's really important that you kind of have this basic understanding of kind of in the flood world. So what you see here is a cross section that's been taken from from a flood model, and the line you see here is essentially a surveyed cross section perpendicular to flow through a creek, and it shows the elevation. So there are thousands of these cross sections that are surveyed throughout the drainage system, typically up to about the 1 square mile drainage area. Those cross sections and other topographic information are then fed into a flood model, and then rainfall for the various return events is then used to generate elevations of where we expect the floodwaters to be under a given return interval. And so you see here the 2, the 5, the 10, the 25, the 50, 100, and the 500 year. These are called multi-frequency events. So once we have the model parameterized with these cross sections and with the topography, then the return interval, for example, a 2-year rain event, is allowed to run through the model, and the model output tells us essentially where the elevation of that floodwater is going to be. And so we've done that in Mecklenburg County. We have that for multiple events, and you can see them listed here. And that's really important so that you have a good understanding of what is going to happen, where, and how often. Another way to think about these multi-frequency return intervals is a 2-year event can also be thought of as having a 50% likelihood of happening during any given year, or 2 divided by 100 is also known as a 50% likelihood of occurring during any given year. So it's really important that this concept of return interval, that's how we think about things. And now James and Neil are going to talk much more in depth about this, but that is a real important concept. And you may recall that I pointed out that we have a lot of building information. So we understand here locally where our structures are in elevation with respect to elevation, and we can then compare them to these return intervals. So for example, this house here is in between the 2 and the 5 year return interval. So we would expect flooding in that structure roughly about once every 3 years. Similarly, this one's a little higher. It's in between the 10 and 25. So we think a 13-year flood might get into that structure. So this is a real important concept about return interval and how often things are expected to happen. Now with the low-cost sensors, all the low-cost sensor is doing is we would install it in the channel, and that low-cost sensor is only providing us with the column, how high is the column of water over that sensor. So it's a pretty basic piece of information. But we take that column of water, we have these sites surveyed, and we can basically convert that to mean sea level elevation, and then compare that elevation information to these return intervals. Now you might say to yourself, well, if you have the elevation of water surface elevation, why don't you just compare that directly to the building elevation information? Well, you run into the issues with extrapolating between the devices, between these low-cost sensors. And that's why we're taking this return interval approach. And Neil and James will talk more about that, about why we use that approach and why it's better for us to use that approach. So again, this concept of threshold flood event, this is just another example of how that information is used. Again, we know the elevation of the building, and we can correlate that back to a return interval. So for this particular structure, we would expect it to flood somewhere in between the 50 and the 100-year event. And that's all correlated by elevation. All right, so now into the risk tools and the flood sensors, essentially this contract that we have with DHS. if any of you all want to reach out to DHS at a later point or see about some of the deliverables we've prepared, that contract number that you see at the top is how you would communicate that or get that information from DHS. So this contract, we're in partnership with DHS to develop flood management risk tools and flood sensors. The contract is over 3 years. We had a base year and then 2 subsequent option years. We are currently about halfway through with option year 2, which in federal parlance is essentially we have about 6 months left of our 3rd year. And that contract from a high level was to test alpha and beta versions of low-cost sensors in an urban environment and report on their installation and performance. That's sort of one side of the contract. The other side of the contract was to develop enhanced risk tools and associated community guidebook. That's more kind of the interpretation of flooding. And then in option year 2, which is what we're in now, merge these efforts to provide a much more comprehensive understanding of our flooding in real time, and then also be able to use that information to provide increased resilience for our community. So just to quickly go through each of the years in this effort, during the base year, we deployed alpha low-cost sensors, and you're going to see that acronym LCS a lot. That means low-cost sensor. And we deployed alpha sensors from 3 different vendors, and we tested them in our urban environment for 6 to 9 months, and we reported on them back to DHS. We also prepared a deployment plan for those low-cost sensors in the next year, which is actually option year 1. It's an error on that slide. And so we used the base year and the experience we have with 3 vendors to figure out how we were going to do a much more broad implementation during option year 2 with a single vendor. And then on the risk tools side of the contract, we conducted national outreach to inform a community guidebook that we were going to prepare in option year 1. We performed a risk tools needs assessment. So that was basically to understand more about our flood risk. And we converted our legacy flood risk tool to an updated platform. During option year 1, or the 2nd year of the contract, the 2 sides of the effort really started to come closer together. As I mentioned, with the flood sensor side, we deployed beta sensors, or sort of 2nd generation sensors from a single vendor into our urban environment and really intensively studied them. And we prepared a performance report and an urban installation guidebook. And that urban installation guidebook is kind of a how-to manual for another community considering deploying low-cost sensors. Additionally, and very importantly, we established the communication between those low-cost sensors and our existing FINS system so that we could then prepare action and watch levels so that we can get that information to our emergency responders 24/7. And then on the risk tools side, we prepared a community guidebook, again, to help other communities understand about how they could possibly manage their flood risk and how we do things in Charlotte-Mecklenburg. We developed an enhanced set of tools and a dashboard to communicate those results. And then option year 2, this is kind of where we are now. We have about 6 months left on this contract. And what happens in option year 2 is the low-cost sensor side and the risk tool side come together. And they come together through this technology that we call real-time inundation mapping. So what's happening is that data is flowing from the low-cost sensors and the USGS sensors, and it's being processed, and an inundation map is being developed. And that inundation map, which is essentially a GIS layer, a polygon, throughout Mecklenburg County of where the floodwaters are at any given time during an event. Or really, it's real time. It's what the extent of the flooding right now in Mecklenburg County. So it provides us with a really powerful tool as far as informing our emergency responders, but then also we can intersect that layer, that inundation extent, with our known locations of flood risk. That was one of the things that really, I think, made a partnership with DHS make a lot of sense from both sides, is we have really good information about our flood risk, its elevation, and its location. Also, during this final year of the project, we think our communication of the countywide impacts from flooding, both during the event as well and in the immediate aftermath of the event, where information is key as far as getting the resources out to the community. So once the flood is over, being able to know what resources to deploy to what locations within the county becomes really important. And having that inundation is really a powerful tool as far as getting help to those that really need it. And it also allowed us to communicate with our elected officials through post-event impact assessment using what we call the ELAT, or losses avoided tool, and the ERART, which is the risk assessment risk reduction tool, with event maximum countywide flood extent. So when you have a flood event, you may have peaks at different points at different times. So what we're doing is we're essentially taking the event maximum inundation, and then after the event is over, so that we can understand exactly where floodwaters impacted. And then, of course, it's all about safety, and it's all about property and lives, and ultimately where we think this is going to lead us is improved flood warnings and alerts, and we're going to be able to get information to the hands of the people that need it in a much more timely fashion. So with that, that's kind of the overview of the project. I'm going to turn it over to Ryan Spidell and Matthew Storosh, and as I said, they're with our water quality group, and they're going to talk to you about the technology of the low-cost sensors and their deployment. So I'll turn it over to you now, Ryan.
Thank you, David. Good morning, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me just fine. So kind of my part in this project was, historically, I've been the leader for the county's water quality network. We have over 33 stations that report real-time water quality data, turbidity, oxygen, temperature, pH, conductivity. All that information is recorded from our field real time and sent to an online database, and where it's then displayed onto a web page. So historically, we have a lot of background information, a lot of background knowledge in how to install field equipment and how to maintain field equipment for longevity purposes. And that's where I came in. When we got this grant and this project came to us, we were asked to help install this technology and help maintain the technology. And that was kind of my portion in the very beginning. In the very beginning of the project, within the base year, as David previously described, the base year for the flood sensor project, we actually got 25 sensors from 3 different vendors. So the base year of the project, that was the primary purpose behind the low-cost sensor evaluation, was to have 3 different vendors kind of competing against one another to get additional funding from the DHS project. So they were, not all of them were the same, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit. You can see in the picture on the right of the screen, you actually have 3 different vendors there. The smallest one on the far left is from a company previously known as POC. So you'll see some of that abbreviations. It's Physical Optics Corporation. That POC is now turned into IntelliSense. So if you see that name somewhere else, POC and IntelliSense are actually the same hardware, same company. They just changed names during the middle of the project. The middle technology there is from a company out of Virginia called Progeny, and the one on the far right is from a company named Vigia, and they are out of Michigan. So 3 different ways of doing it, all recording the same thing, all trying to get water level and stage. So each of them have a couple different ways of doing it. They all use cellular communication to get the data from the field to the cloud network for storage. In the very beginning, all three of these vendors have the capability, and they still have the capability of their own cloud network. And I believe Josh probably talked about this a little bit about communication purposes, but two of the vendors used completely cellular, and one of the vendors used radio communication to where we made a small mesh network. And that's what you see here in the second bullet, 5 mesh networks with 4 to 5 low-cost sensors per network. So we took these 25 vendors, 25 pieces of equipment from the 3 vendors and put them at 25 different sites. So we put them all side by side by side, and that was the whole point of our base year comparison, was to actually have a side by side comparison, so that way we could do a performance report. And our performance report actually led into the decision for DHS to give additional grant money to another vendor. So it was us and about 4 or 5 other stakeholders around the country that were doing similar testing all at the same time. A little bit different purposes in each stakeholder's territory, but still doing the same kind of evaluations. One thing that was different between the base year and option year 1 is that in the base year we were evaluating the devices more for performance, and we chose the sites based on I guess kind of 2 different criteria. One was availability to install the equipment, and also having a close enough range for the radio equipment to talk to each other. That is a difference from the option year 1, because when we go into option year 1 for the beta versions, we actually chose the sites based upon our needs as a community, based upon the different flood risks that we needed to cover. So here in the bottom left-hand pictures, the 2 pictures you see there with the yellow circles, you actually see similar technology installed on this from 2 different vendors on one bracket in the stream, and then the picture on the middle picture with the log jam there against the culvert. That is one of the vendors. You can briefly see the PVC pipe sticking up there in the middle. As you can tell, that's a lot of equipment sticking up in the middle of the stream, and as you see, also has the potential to collect a lot of debris. So, next slide, David. So at the end of our base year sampling, we installed all these guys in the field, and we can talk more about installation costs, and Matthew's actually going to talk about that here in a little bit. But as you can see, basically in the 3 graphs or 3 charts that you see here, we have the first company is Progeny, second company is POC or IntelliSense, and then the third company is Evigia. I think probably the overall line takeaway message from this is that we had 2 out of 3 vendors that successfully did what we needed to do. You can see the third vendor there. Basically the green, if you see green, that means that we got reporting values from those fields from February to April. We evaluated them over this 3-month period because in the very beginning, we installed almost all of them in September and October of 2018, and they all had firmware issues, and that's all to be expected with alpha equipment. It was not until the beginning of January, after December, that all 3 companies got their firmware kinks kind of worked out, and that's when we started getting reliable data from all 3 vendors. So that's where we decided to do our evaluation at. So in the months of February, March, and April, you can see the results that we got. It's pretty close comparison between Progeny and POC as terms of data reliability and just overall reliability as a product. You see Evigia there. Evigia, their alpha units were not very good units. They were that piece of PVC pipe that you saw sticking up there that sticks up about 3 feet in the water. When we first got that equipment, we saw, I was like, don't know how long this is going to last, but we'll try it out. So that's what we did, and that was our results. So Since that time, they have actually gone probably leap years in advancing their technology. And they've actually gotten a little bit better to where we have tested some of their beta versions as well. So I think, yeah, that'll be it. David, next slide. So option year 1, we got done with the base year, and that's where we were testing 3 different vendors. Well, in option year 1, only one vendor was selected to move forward with the DHS program. That one vendor was POC or IntelliSense. And one reason that we help choose or help suggest to DHS that this company might be very good is that you see in that bottom left-hand picture, that's all the equipment that's needed. You have the cable and a pressure transducer attached to the end of that cable, and then you have the upper head unit, or that's what we call the upper head unit. So within this upper head unit, you see the actual solar panels. You see antennas attached to it, and everything is integrated into this one piece of equipment. You know, everything there together probably weighs 6-7 pounds. It could be easily mounted on any fence post, railing, T-post, anything really that is stable to get it up out of the floodplain. And they were very easy to install and very easy to maintain. And those are some of the deciding factors that we help make our decision. And, we report on that, and we'll talk about that just a little bit. But in option year 1, we got 98 flood sensors from DHS from this one vendor from POC/IntelliSense. These were their beta versions. Within that, we took some lessons learned from our base year and we applied them to option year 1. So you see there in the middle picture to where we actually had this just aluminum angle bracket that we attached to a, this could be a surveying stake or a piece of rebar that we drive in the creek bed. And we take it, we drive it in the creek bed, and we attach the piece of aluminum angle bracket using all stainless steel hardware because it all resides underwater. You don't have to put it underwater, but in most cases we put them in the streams and put them underwater. So we use stainless steel hardware, and you can also see the electrical conduit that we use there to help protect the data cable that goes from the pressure transducer itself to the head unit. And then the the conduit and the data cable run all the way up the stream bank up to wherever you mount your head unit to get that out of the floodplain. One thing we did was we actually have our floodplain mapping model for Mecklenburg County to where we were able to see, okay, we're at this site at this XY location. What is our 100-year floodplain depth or Z? And we were able to look at all those and say, okay, well, we need to, at this location, at this sidewalk, we need to be sure this head unit is mounted 6 feet or 10 feet. So that's all dependent, that is site specific, dependent upon your location. That's something that you should take into account whenever you go to install these in the field. And I think a lot of that information is out there. So even if you don't have a local floodplain model, the state has the cross sections where you can actually see the flood elevations. So, previously I told you about the difference between option year 1 and the base year about how we selected the site locations. What you see there on the far right-hand side is a map of our existing USGS stage gauges, which are in the green circles, our low-cost sensors for the alpha versions, red triangles, and then the 91, 93 beta sites that are the blue squares. And like I said, basically we went into a exercise to where we looked at our flood risk throughout the county and decided where we needed additional monitoring at. And that is where we decided to put our beta versions at, to do more performance testing of those. Some of those we actually correlated at existing USGS gauge stations, and we're not going to sit here and tell you that these sensors are USGS gauge stations. They're not. They do not measure to the precision that a USGS gauge will. But in our testing, they were accurate. They were within the accuracy specifications of what the vendor provided, which was plus or minus usually about 2% of the reading. And sometimes that's less than a half an inch. And for our purposes, Tim Troutman, the program manager for the flood mitigation program, has always kind of, what he said about these units is that they are fire alarms for the creeks. So that's kind of the notion that we're going with. They do measure the height, and we've seen through our performance measures that they are accurate enough to actually put into the models on the back end. And that's what option year 2 is all about. So next slide. Here, I will turn it over to Matthew. Matthew did a lot of the work on this urban installation guidebook, and this is a guidebook that we provided at the end of our beta testing last year. This is available on the DHS website. It is a great handbook for all different levels of communities. It takes in a lot of different scenarios, a lot of different ways that we did the mounting, and I'll turn it over to Matthew at this point.
Good morning, everybody. My name's Matthew Storish. I'm with Charlotte-Mecklenburg Stormwater Services Water Quality Program. I'm a senior environmental specialist. Ryan Spidell is my supervisor, and about a year ago when he was promoted to a supervisor, I took over his position overseeing our water quality program and also the deployment of our beta year of flood sensors. So I'll be here presenting on this topic. I know that there's a lot of interest, and I hope that we can be a valuable resource to y'all. Speaking of resources, the Urban Installation Guidebook, like Ryan said, was part of our grant requirements. It, in essence, is a tool for local communities such as yours to go out and install flood sensors. There were a lot of things that we had to consider when installing flood sensors throughout Mecklenburg County due to varying geographical and physical factors. But overall, some big points are you have to consider encroachments, cellular reception if you're using cellular versus iridium, access for installation and maintenance. You've got field staff out there, it's got to be a safe location. Sunlight visibility, these all run off of solar. So, they couldn't be in the woods, and here in the southeast, it's a big requirement with all the foliage that we have to have good sunlight. Vegetation control, again, access for your employees and reduction in loss of sunlight, and then wet versus dry installs. So there's just, again, a lot of factors to consider, and we wanted this urban installation guidebook to be a tool for everybody to have at their disposal to help them learn from the lessons that we kind of took the long road to learn. So in the bottom left-hand corner, you will see a link to the DHS website where you can access this urban installation guidebook. Feel free to reach out to myself or Ryan if you have any questions. This is a fluid process. Since we published this back in April, things have changed. We've learned new lessons, but we're all learning, and we want to learn from y'all and be here as a resource. Looking at the middle picture, I kind of want to give everyone an overview of why these are low-cost flood sensors. Like Ryan said, the slide before, there's a head unit, a data communication cable, and a pressure transducer that goes in the creek. That's the equipment that you're going to get from the vendor and perhaps a camera. But in terms of installing them in the site, we needed to keep it simple because we installed over the past few years over 125 sites. So it had to be financially viable as well as physically viable for our staff to install and maintain. And you can see in further detail in the Urban Installation Guidebook all the resources that we used. And then to the right is just a nice pretty image of a installed site on a sunny day and hopefully doing its job. So David, if you want to go to the next slide, that'd be great. Thanks. So just some, again, broad overview of the installation process. After you've done your site recon, figured out where it's safe to install your head unit, where it won't flood, because while they, for the most part, are water resilient, they are not waterproof at this point, so you need them above your base flood elevation. First step is attach and positioning of the head unit for solar power. Next is routing and protecting the data communication cable. We use 3/4 inch flexible non-metallic conduit. You could try installing these data communication cables without any protection, but from our experience, you're going to lose equipment real fast. So we found this to be a simple, somewhat financially viable way of installing these. And then third step is attachment and positioning of the in-stream sensor to a mounting bracket in the creek. We did all this manually. We just, with a 5-pound hammer, drove those pins into the creek and then would mount the sensor in the creek. Again, you gotta know your streams. We were dealing with a lot of substrate that was predominantly sand with cobble or boulder. Not a ton of bedrock. If you're dealing with an environment with more bedrock, you may have to look into other ways of mounting the lower sensor. But again, just know your streams. David, Ray, continue on. Key takeaways: be flexible in your deployment, guys. I know a lot of us are dealing with urban environments. That being said, vandalism is a problem. We've experienced it. People are interested when there's technology out there and it's fancy and shiny, and we've had people rip head units off of a post or take a baseball bat to them. But all in all, lesson learned: be flexible. You know, we've used everything from galvanized fence posts, mounted them on a bridge at UNC Charlotte. We've used pre-existing light poles and stream gauges. So use the tools and resources that are out there. It's a good way to save money if you're not having to buy X number of galvanized posts. Secure your site. This is a huge one, and a lesson that we learned after the Urban Installation Guidebook was published and we started having some heavier rain events is that conduit. We had runs anywhere from 15 feet of conduit to over 100 feet. And when you have a major storm event coming down a flashy urban creek, that water is moving fast. It's moving trees, it's moving tires, rocks. So you got to figure a 60-foot stretch of conduit whipping around in the water is going to put a lot of stress on that small bolt that's holding the pressure transducer to the mounting bracket in the creek. So riprap, great resource. Pile it up on top of your conduit, protect your conduit. In that top right photo, you can see a landscape stable being installed in the grass. We've since converted to rebar J-hooks. These are available on Amazon. They come in 12, 16, and even 18 inches. These are great because they provide a little bit more security for your conduit. Again, get creative, guys. We're still learning. So if anybody finds an even better source for securing conduit, we are open to learning from y'all as well. And then probably my big third takeaway is monitor your data. In our current iteration, there is no QA/QC on the data that we have coming in. However, every morning, myself and my staff, which is composed of 4 field technicians, we go on to Contrail, which is a data viewing software, and we look at our flood sensors. We all know our sites really well, and I keep coming back to that point. Know your sites, know your environment. if I know that a site is always a wet install and I see it's dry, something's probably wrong, and I'll request someone to go out there and check it out. These also provide, reviewing your data also provides a way to kind of just know what's going on in your community, stage, and kind of how floods are looking. So just monitor your data, otherwise it's not very useful to you or your community. I'm ready for the next one, David. So talking about maintenance, David Craning hit on this earlier. I'm going to go over option year 1 and then option year 2, and then give you guys some takeaways that we've learned. But option year 1, part of our grant was going out monthly to inspect the sites. So every month, each field staff technician had a certain number of sites that they would go out to on a monthly basis. They would clear debris, do vegetation control for site maintenance for their safety as well as for solar availability, and then check for physical damage to all aspects of your install, including the head unit, your camera if you have one, conduit and communication cable, and the lower sensor. And then finally, we took validation measurements every time we were out there, and that provided us with data to check the accuracy of the lower sensors, like Ryan mentioned earlier, and we were greatly pleased with the results. Moving on to option year 2, which is what we're halfway through at this point. So we've reduced it to quarterly inspections. I would recommend maybe starting with monthly if anybody's getting a program up and running. You know, it's going to take time to get things dialed in. It took time for us to learn all of our sites, to learn flow events, which sites had more tires going through it or trees that were going to take out the conduit. But at this point, we're down to quarterly. During those quarterly inspections, we do the same 4 things: clear debris, vegetation control, check for physical damage, and validation measurement. And then on an as-need basis, we address issues such as vandalism, failed components, maybe a failed cell modem or a failed lower sensor, and deal with any storm damage on an as-needed basis. And the way that we identify these issues, again, is by monitoring our data. If we see something is wrong with the data that we're seeing or not seeing, it's an indicator that we need to go out there and inspect the site. And then another nice takeaway is track all maintenance operations. We use an in-house database called Environmental Data Management System. We track any site inspection, what work was done, if a validation measurement was taken, the date, time, and the inspector. This is a way for us to track sites that have a lot of issues that maybe we just need to relocate it. It's a way for us to track failures in the instruments so that we could give positive feedback or constructive feedback to the vendors saying, hey, you guys maybe should add another solar panel. We're seeing a lot of solar issues, or your lower sensor is ripping, like you should use a different compound for the mold. So it's a really valuable resource both for yourself, for sharing with other communities and stakeholders, and for the vendors. So we're good on this slide, David. I'll pass it off to Ryan to talk about installation costs. And again, feel free to reach out to us. I think that's the big takeaway, is that we're stakeholders as well. And we asked ourselves, how can we help other communities be successful in developing their flood resiliency program? So we're here as a resource for y'all. If you have any questions, again, feel free to reach out, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Matthew. So I'm going to cover just installation costs. And I think a lot of you submitted questions ahead of time whenever you registered for this webinar. And this was an overlying question we saw a couple times was cost. You know, that's what a lot of people are interested in. And we can say we got a quote for the production units from IntelliSense, and the quote had pretty much the bundle of equipment that you would need, would be your lower sensor with a cable and a head unit, was just shy of $3,000. It was somewhere between $2,800 and $2,900. So that is kind of the price point that you're looking at for this. I know there's different vendors out there, and one of the things that DHS wanted to happen as a result of this project was to get the pre-existing companies that are out there in the world, the YSI, Sutron, different companies that are already making water quality monitoring equipment or stage monitoring equipment. They wanted them to make more of a introductory type pricing equipment, and that is what has happened. Those two vendors I just talked about, they have introduced a much lower price point piece of equipment to try to make it more available to communities throughout the United States. And that was one of the underlying goals of the DHS project, was to make this technology more available to help make communities throughout the U.S. more resilient to floods. So that's the purchase price for the equipment. Some of the general material costs that you see over in Table 1, it's not a lot. A galvanized fence post, some steel stakes, conduit. The conduit's your most site-dependent cost. We could get it from Home Depot for 65 cents a foot. We were buying 250, 500-foot rolls of conduit at the time. I think we ended up buying close to a half a mile of conduit to install all these sites. But at 65 cents a foot, depending on how many sites you're installing and the length of the run from the head unit down to your lower sensor, that's your most variable cost. Everything else, hardware store, not very much. As you see, it's about $75 per site. One thing that we did do is we included a sign, and we think that helps with not only providing information to the public, but also just providing information about what we're doing. So we actually have a lot of different citizens that have these in their neighborhoods that can contact Matthew or Josh and say, hey, why is this not working? Or when's this going to be back up? So we actually get a lot of community involvement and people requesting to know more about the protection. And we actually installed a couple of these on private property, and we had no problems getting permission from the private property individuals, because they know, hey, we've got property in the floodplain, and basically we portray it to them as, we're going to help protect your property by installing this equipment to get more information and potentially do flood warnings. So the labor cost, we got it down on average about 2.5 labor hours per site for the installation. If you have 2 people doing it, it's roughly going to take an hour and 15 minutes to install one of these sites. I think by the end of the 93 installations that Matthew and the team did, they got it down to even less than that. But it's site specific. The longer the run, a little more time it takes. Depends on how many times you have to try to find a suitable place to install the in-stream sensor. So it is a little bit dependent, but on average, we were averaging about 2.5 labor hours per site. The monthly checks and validations, like Matthew mentioned, during the option year 1, we did monthly checks because we were trying to do more of the validations and performance reports. We're now doing quarterly checks, but we also have a year of these guys being installed in the field. So I think that was a great recommendation that Matthew made, was to probably the first 6 months until you work out all the kinks at your sites. You probably want to visit these sites monthly. After that, you might go to quarterly. You just have to play it by ear and kind of let it be a fluid resolution. So repairs, Matthew can actually speak to this, but Matthew makes a lot of repairs, and our team goes out and makes the repairs. But just depends on what's going on. You know, we'll have lower units that quit reporting, and Matthew goes out with a laptop and hooks up to the unit, and he can look and see, has the lower unit failed? Has it simply become unplugged? Do we need a new lower unit? Does it need to be calibrated? Is the head unit not reporting? So it is the number of hours that is for that repair is dependent upon the repair. You know, most repairs take usually less than an hour. So you can swap out a whole entire site in probably 2 labor hours. So it's not a very time intensive thing, but depending upon the number of sites, it definitely accumulates. So with us having, I think we currently have close to 80 sites right now. It is a full-time job. So with that many sites, it's definitely a requirement to have someone dedicated to it. So I think that is it, David. We'll pass it off to Josh.
Thanks, Ryan. Yes, yeah, the important thing to remember is you can't set it and forget it. I mean, you do need to maintain these pieces of equipment as you would anything that you're deploying in the creek. I just want to do a quick check-in with Regina. Regina, was there anything that we needed to address? Any questions or anything?
Yes, we had a couple of questions. One person was wondering if you had contracted with installers or worked with town partners like Public Works to install and maintain your 125 sensors.
We do that all in-house.
Through your stormwater group?
Yes, Matthew and Ryan and the group that they work in and lead, we do that all in-house.
Great. And the other question was, is there lightning protection since these are mounted to metallic poles?
Ryan, Matthew?
So currently we do not ground the sites. We do this at our water quality instruments, but thus far in the past 2.5 years, we have not had any circumstances where a unit has failed due to electrical issues.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that a little bit. Like Matthew said, at our water quality sites, we do, you know, these are low-cost flood sensors. Our water quality sites are not low-cost, so we do add grounding protection and lightning protection both to the cellular communication and just to the job boxes themselves. So we brought this up with the vendor back during the alpha testing, and the vendors were not really concerned about it. So like Matthew said, we've not had any failures from them in the 2 years that we've been testing them, but that doesn't mean it couldn't happen in the next thunderstorm. So that's where we stand with that.
Wonderful. Well, thanks for your answers to these questions, and to the audience, we welcome your questions through the Q&A, and we'll continue on. Thanks.
Thanks, Regina. So now we're going to talk about low-cost sensor communication, essentially how the information that's collected at the sensor gets to a place where it can actually be used and acted upon. And that's going to be handled by Josh McSwain. So Josh, turn it over to you.
All right, good morning. Josh McSwain with Charlotte Mecklenburg, and I manage the FINS flood system for Mecklenburg County. So my role, it was kind of natural for me to step in and take on the communication portion of these flood sensors. FINS has been around for 20 years now, and it uses similar technology as the flood sensors. The USGS does use alert radio protocol, does not use cellular, and most of these sensors do use cellular communication. So I want to mention one thing before I talk about communication is back in the beginning, and this will be important to some of you community agencies, we had to work with the City of Charlotte DOT to establish a right-of-way agreement to allow us to install these sensors anywhere that was within their right of way. So, and there was some criteria there that they had to be behind some type of barrier, guardrail, handrail, because if they were installed just along the side of the road, they had to be breakaway poles. So that was extra cost. So make sure you do your homework up front and work with your local DOTs if you're going to install these along the roadsides. Just check into it. So sensor communication, I'm going to talk about the raw data that's transmitted from the sensor. So it's a unique protocol to each vendor. The data is either transmitted radio, which Ryan talked about previously. We found out in the base year working with the alphas that the radio option was not good for our area. With the terrain that we have and the distances up and downstream, the radios just weren't powerful enough to transmit. But if you use radios, of course, it's free communication, 900 megahertz radio. And the way it's set up for the vendors that we worked with is the radio, they report to each other. So one radio A reports to B reports to C, and then C either reports to what they call a gateway with a cellular modem that then transmits the data either to a local server or the vendor server. So radio is an option, but they need to be within less than 1,000 feet for sure, and they need to be in a mesh network that Ryan talked about earlier. So if you have two streams coming together, maybe into a river or just a larger stream, that's the type of setup that you would use radios for. So you would have a radio at up and downstream of the confluence, and then one upstream of the trib. They're all close together and can talk to each other and transmit the data to the gateway or to a base station if that's nearby. So cellular, that's the most popular way to go. Things to consider there would obviously be your service area. In Charlotte and Mecklenburg County, we have a very good cellular network. We did install some sensors in remote areas of the county, lower in the terrain, just to see if that would affect the cellular performance. Turns out it didn't, but again, that's because we have a really good cellular network here. So consider your provider in your area when thinking about radio or cellular. And then the satellite option, it is an option with sensors with different companies. We didn't use it. We didn't test it. But the IntelliSense sensors, they do have the option of using satellite to transmit. So that's talking about the raw data. Let's see. The data, I saw a question yesterday talking about the transmission rate. So it's going to be different depending on which vendor you go with. Currently, we're transmitting every 10 minutes on when we're on normal conditions. But when a flood event is recognized, then the data transmits every 3 minutes. So you do have more of an impact on your battery and your cellular transmission during a flood event, but it hasn't been an issue for us. Our events are quick. Flash floods, they're up and down in less than 2 hours pretty easily most of the time. So every 10 minutes, unless an event takes place, and then it switches to 3 minutes. So that's unique to each vendor. So make a note to ask specifically about the transmission rate. Some of them may be 15, some of them may be 5, but that automatic switching over to the 3 minute option during a flood event is very key. Data types that are reported, I just threw out there some: stage, battery voltage, rain increment. We haven't talked about rain up to this point, but depending on which vendor you go with, you're more likely going to have a rain gauge that can be plugged into your upper unit, your main unit. So then you can transmit rain data, but that was not part of our testing. We tested just stage and these other data types. So temperature, soil moisture, again, that's an add-on. Your modem strength, and so there's a lot of different data types that come in. The primary one would be stage, and then battery voltage. That's what Matthew and his group looks at to determine if they need to visit the site to troubleshoot, or I need to look into the data and see if there's a communication issue. So we do have predetermined thresholds that are identified, and that's for flood warning, but there's also an option to establish thresholds within the sensor itself, within the firmware. So that's going back to that trigger to a 3-minute that I was talking about. When a flash flood is recognized by the sensor, by the field unit itself, then the unit can be set up to automatically take a photo, or switch to a faster transmission rate, or take a rain reading, or whatever the customer would like to do. Those thresholds are there in the firmware of the unit, and so yeah, that's an option to ask the vendor about. All right, let's go to the next slide, David. So now we're talking about managing sensor settings and data. So we do all this. Let me back up. So in the alpha and testing phase, we did use the vendor's database and our server and website. So we had a login to, I say vendor, the vendors, all three. We had to go to their website to look at the data. So months go by, and we start to realize, hey, maybe we could get this data directly to our server. So we went to our vendor, which is One Rain out of Colorado, and started working with them to see if we could get the sensors to report directly to us. Because initially it was set up that the units would transmit to the vendor, and then the vendor would basically forward it to our server. So, so we worked with the software vendor, and we were able to get the units, the field units, to report directly to us. So that's an option for everyone to consider when you're looking at these sensors. Is, are you going to use the vendor's provided database and website, or are you going to go with a third-party software like we have to manage all your data and your alerts and notifications? So just make a note to research that. So managing sensor settings and data, system alarms. This again goes back to helps maintenance staff, field staff, Matthew and his team. We can set up alarms to alert us low battery voltage at the sensors. Dynamic symbols, that's just an example of symbols simply changing. So when you look at the map, you know something has taken place. Automatic reports, all that can be done to inform staff that action needs to take place. Flood alerts, these are automatically run. This is where your warnings go out, your alarms are triggered, your notifications. On the right is an example of an email that goes out to emergency management and stormwater staff and other target groups. That does not go to the public. That is specific information that emergency management wanted to know. They basically, really all they want to know is that first line. what level of alarm is it, and where is it? And then staff can use everything below that for additional details. Yeah, and there was a note there to just be sure to discuss this with your vendor and ask them if they're going to offer alarming options, notification options, or you're going to have to do that in-house. Yeah, so in Contrail, which is the software that we've been using, anyone, the citizen, for example, can sign up if they go to, if they have a flood sensor installed near their home and they want to get notifications from it. These are not flood alerts. These are just notifications of when the stream is at a certain level. Then they can sign up for that. That was part of the communication piece of the contract, was to see how we can get this data to citizens. So that is an option on Contrail. It's not in production. It's just been proven the technology will work. So moving on here, vendor application. That I've already talked about that. You need to make sure that what your vendor is going to offer with the sensor, or if you need to go in-house with an option. Next slide, David. So apps and dashboards, I'll go through this real quick. These are, again, other ways to create quick views inside your software. We use these daily to look at creek cameras, to look at local sensor data, USGS gauge data. There's the web address for our public-facing server. If you want to check it out, you can see all the local sensors. You can see all the USGS and sensors also. Two-way communication. This is something that's very useful. In the beginning, we did not have two-way communication capabilities. So if the unit needed to be rebooted, just for example, somebody physically had to go out there or restart it, I guess. But now we can do this through two-way communications. It is software specific, but we can do things like request a photo or schedule a photo, reset the time, reset the sensor. Several options that are available. Maybe change the threshold. So check with your vendor and see what options are available there. And finally, research. This is part of option year 2, where we're exploring the communication options of the sensors. So things like sending out weather alerts automatically to smart devices. We get those on the iPhones now if a storm's coming, for example, a flash flood, whatever emergency events, that they currently do not come directly from the flood sensor. So it has to go to a middle or a third party software package, or check with your vendor that provides the sensor and see what option they have there in communication. Locally, we use Everbridge. So automatically the data goes to Contrail and then Everbridge, and then out to iPaws. Another one, Charmac Alerts, that's just a local emergency message that local citizens can subscribe to. I added Fireman. I'm sure many of us are familiar with the North Carolina Fireman system. We can pass data to them via an API. So that's another option, is you can interact with other systems to communicate local sensor data and all flood warning data. And then finally, social media and Waze, the transportation application. That's an option that the sensor could communicate to Waze. Like, for example, if you have a flood sensor installed at a creek crossing and the road, the sensor determines that the road is flooded, then that can be communicated directly to Waze, and then the users of Waze can see that the flood is overtopped and need to choose another route. So those are just some quick communication options. If you have any questions, put them in the Q&A and we can revisit it at the end. So thank you, David. That's it.
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, and I think we kind of touched on the additional capability of some of these sensors having the ability to take a still image or a photograph. That technology is there. You need to strike a balance between the size of the image, the number of bytes, because you're going to be, obviously it's going to take more time to transmit via your cell or radio signal, and there's additional battery consumption. So that's not something that you want to take a picture every single data transmission, but the technology is there, and a lot of these units have cameras, or you have an option for a camera. And I will say that our emergency responders, they love having images of what is actually going on in these creeks. Obviously, not something that works really well at night. It is just a standard camera. It's not really a night vision sort of camera, but an image can definitely be a very powerful thing, especially when communicating to the emergency responders. Regina, were there any additional questions that we need to address before moving on?
We did have 2 questions during that session. There was one, to incorporate the data into Contrail, is it getting it directly from the sensor or from an API set up by the vendor that they hit to ingest the data?
No, that's coming directly from the flood sensor. So when Matthew and his team installs the sensor, they simply enter a unique IP address and a port number directly in the firmware of the sensor. And every 10 minutes, it transmits directly to our Contrail server. So the API comes in play on if you want to send your data from Contrail out to another system, or another system wants to call into Contrail to download the data.
Great, thank you. The other question is, what are approximate annual costs, self-service, data storage, alert systems, etc.?
At a per sensor cost, I'm going to answer this 2 ways. I know with vendors, if you go with a vendor to store it and have access to it, that's part of your monthly service subscription. So if you subscribe to your vendor's package, then you get your cell data paid for, and you get your data storage, and you get an option to interact with it. And that's what I've seen. That's in like the $25 to $30 a month per sensor range. But for us locally, we pay $6 or $7 a month per sensor for the cell service. And the storage cost, all that is incorporated into existing servers that we already have. So ours is going to be more expensive just because we have thousands of records coming into Contrail, plus all the water quality data. So I can't really give you what our local cost is per sensor, but I know if you go with the vendor, then you're going to be in the $25 to $30 range. That's the last I've seen. So it may have changed. I don't know if Matthew or Ryan know any more about that.
Great. Well, thank you for that estimate. Really appreciate it. That's the end of the questions, David.
Thanks, Regina. Okay, so next we're going to transition the presentation over to James Scanlon and Neil Banerjee, and we're going to be talking about flood inundation mapping for flood monitoring and response. We're essentially taking the data from the low-cost sensors, merging it or comparing it with a lot of the information from our flood mapping and our topography, and then creating an inundation mapping that allows us to have a better understanding of what's happening on the ground. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to James.
Thank you, David. Hopefully everybody can hear me. Good morning, and thanks for attending today's presentation. My name is James Scanlon. I'm a GIS analyst with Mecklenburg County. I work with Stormwater Services, Charlotte-Mecklenburg Stormwater Services, to basically manage, maintain, and analyze data related to floods, among other things. But A lot of my work centers on supporting the flood mitigation and engineering programs. So my role in this project is really to, for one, assist and communicate with our consultant ESP on evaluating deliverables. And even though I'm not doing the heavy lifting as far as developing the products, or I'm not out in the field with the sensors, I can serve in an advisory role to kind of take some ideas that are being presented to use with these sensors and be able to determine what's feasible to do and how we would do it, and then be able to translate that to not only our vendor but other resources within our GIS department. It's important for me to be involved because I'll be a practitioner of this software when it's developed and turned over to us. So being involved in this team has been very beneficial from that aspect. And I did serve a role in helping lay out where these sensors were going to be located. We had a lot of different use cases we wanted to capture, some related to flood mitigation, some were just other cases we were testing the sensors viability for. But as far as it relates to flood coverage and monitoring, we wanted to try to capture as much of our flood risk as possible. So when we laid out the sensors that we had, we were able to get about 96% of our known flood risk covered. Known flood risk would basically be our FEMA streams, where we do a lot of analysis on flood-prone buildings and quantify the risk in terms of score and have a strategy to mitigate those properties. So I'll just kind of go ahead and talk about where we're at with our program and how the DHS fits into the picture and how we're helping each other. We understand, DHS understands that storm events are inevitable. They are an occurrence of nature. We can't predict when and where they're happening. We can predict that they will happen, but we can't predict when, and we can't predict how much. But we have an idea of where the highest risks are. So we try to cover all the bases as best we can with our planning endeavors, and then we want to be able to respond both while the event is occurring and afterwards, be able to help the recovery process. So the overall goal is to be proactive and mitigate and minimize damages so that you don't have as much risk for when the next event could occur. You can think about it in terms of three general phases: before, during, and after. Next slide, please. So before, as you would think, is our planning, where we, I would say our group is very proficient at planning. We have a risk assessment, risk reduction plan that has been implemented for almost 10 years now. It's data-driven, it's goal-driven. We have the end in mind with what we're doing. We want to get to a certain point where the joke is we'll all be working ourselves out of a job eventually, but we do want to reduce this risk in our community as much as possible with the funding we have. So it's data driven. We know where the risk is. We have mitigation strategies and dedicated funding to address it. During an event, we have a very mature fin system, as David and Josh alluded to. We have been working with our emergency responders for years with our quote unquote smoke detectors in the creek to let them know where the problems are and how to respond, and give them warnings ahead of time so that they can get out there before the worst is to occur. And then after we have the ability, whenever an event occurs, we do assess it. We've been using traditional methods, but this program is an opportunity to kind of improve in that regard. We'll be able to, not necessarily have to rely on people on the ground to assess the impacts and collect the data. We'll be able to do it remotely and be able to increase our turnaround time. Next slide, please. So if you think about it, we've kind of got the before part covered. We know where our risks are, and we have information like building information, detailed flood models, our flood warning system. We have a lot of analysis, a lot of resources to perform analysis and be proactive. During the event, we do have the flood warning system, but as we found out during the Hurricane Florence event in 2018, we had blind spots in our system. That's a big event that could impact a very large area. And while we have a very comprehensive and dense sensor network, it doesn't cover everywhere that could be potentially impacted. So having more sensors in the creek will allow us to observe where the problems are occurring right now. And with this flood inundation mapping, we'll have a visual depiction of it, as well as we'll be able to determine which buildings and roads are being impacted at any given time by the aerial extent of the flood coverage. And then afterwards, again, this is an area for improvement. We've been relying on kind of older methods of waiting for reports to come in, waiting for phone calls from affected residents, taking our collector apps and collecting high water marks, and then having to correct those for ground elevation. And then you can do your analysis on which buildings were impacted and determine your substantial damages and things. So all of those processes, while they're accepted, are time consuming, and we just want to be more efficient so that we can identify what our funding needs are to help recover and mitigate future damages. And then we also have a program where we are evaluating our previous mitigation efforts as kind of like a program outcome measure, and we're seeing where we've avoided flood losses by mitigating. And having this new inundation mapping technology and the associated products is really going to help us do these things quickly and efficiently and with less field resources and less time. Next slide, please. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Neil Banerjee with ESP. ESP has been very integral in helping us come up with the products we're going to need to tackle these challenges, and they've been invaluable resources for helping us identify the best approach to developing flood inundation mapping and how we're going to do our post-flood analysis. So at this time, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Neil, and he can take it from here to go into the details of what we're developing.
Great. Everyone can hear me? Great. Thank you, James, and thank you. We appreciate the opportunity to speak. My name is Neil Banerjee. I'm with ESP. I'm the project manager on ESP side, so I'm working with David Key and our staff. We have some engineers, GIS folks, and application developers to make all this happen. So really, I have a lot of slides, so I'll try to go through some of these quickly that have already been touched on earlier, but really our role, the others have talked about this great data that is coming in real time, and it's try to take that and make situational awareness of what's happening, not only at the gauges, but in between the gauges and who is it impacting. So from a high level, some of the things you want to understand about the severity of event, the extent. So we've been talking about flood inundation. So that's basically how far does, what's the area that gets wet. So that's one of the products we're trying to produce. Another is the magnitude that can be often defined by depth or velocity, duration. So that's another product. We're not only mapping the extent, but also the depth. And then finally, as James alluded to, really to help them guide their, not only the response, during the event, but also the mitigation and program planning after the response is who's impacted, how often are they impacted and what can we do about it? So, this has always been a desire to have this information following the flood. I remember back after Hurricane Floyd was involved in high water mark collection. Of course, in some cases you have to wait days when the water subsides. Here in Mecklenburg County, one thing that's kind of unique is most of the water in Mecklenburg County originates. So we're kind of on the ridge of the Yadkin and the Catawba River basins. So anyhow, I guess traditional approaches are you wait till after the storm, you collect high water marks, you can use the US gauges. As many of you know, they're kind of sporadic throughout the state. I mean, even before the sensors, Mecklenburg County had one of the best or most dense networks probably in the country. And there's also, a whole bunch of services that I'll just show you some screenshots in a bit. There's on the, these are the field side. There is the model side where, there's the national model, water model and others where you're trying to use models to predict and then look backs. Next slide, please. So some of the challenges with those is probably a big one is the cost and resources to obtain that data. It's expensive to send people out, try to get that. And even when you get out there, you have a limited ability to, you're still only covering kind of point locations. And sometimes you have to wait after the storm. The high water marks might not be very good. And if you're using a modeling approach, as we all see with, weather forecasts, hurricane forecasts, every sort of forecast, there's always, even though it's using the best sciences, and these things are improving, there's always sometimes a gap between the reality of what's on the ground versus what was predicted. So the good news is, I think there's been probably, especially in the last 5-10 years, a huge advancement. So we can now get more data faster, cheaper, and process it. So that was a lot of the low-cost sensors themselves are part of that. Next slide. So I'll just touch on these briefly. There's already a number of great resources. The folks have already talked about fins. Many of you in North Carolina are familiar with FIMAN. But if you're not, there's the USGS, NOAA. There's many other folks out there that are doing similar kind of things in the flood hazard world, I guess, if you will. The focus used to be on producing FEMA flood maps, but probably about 5-6 years ago, after we keep having 100-year events every year, there's been a huge move towards trying to help during the storms, because one of the challenges before is there'd be a big storm event and they would ask the floodplain people, well, where's it going to flood? And all you had to look at was a flood map, and you could kind of give relative proportions. Well, this is bigger or smaller. So we're trying to close that gap. And at the bottom, you can see, and I already mentioned the National Water Model, there's a number of, I guess, empirical models, and I know the insurance industry, risk, there's like the big data world. So there's a lot of research and movement on that end. Which again, those are probably not as field based, but there's a lot of activity in this market sector. Next slide, please. So here's an example of the fins. You've already seen that with the rain in the stream stages. Next slide. Some of the other ones, FIMAN, again, NOAA, National Water Model, Southeast River Forecast. So if the problem now is, everyone's trying to there's a lot of good work being done out there. So if you are a community or university or anything else trying to do this, you don't have to go alone. There's a lot of people trying to attack the same problem. Next slide. So, really the crux in our involvement, so we're grateful this has been one of the most exciting and probably challenging projects. We've been involved since the base year and the option year one, working on the risk tools, but this is where where the really cool stuff happens, where we're integrating all these tools and algorithms and everything that we've been developing with this real-time data. So what we're trying to do is develop these continuous flooding inundation maps during an event, so we can visualize it, see what's happening, as it is happening, and then overlay that with a built environment. Even though there's a lot of other work going on, I think one of the limitations in many of those is, you're still only getting data and information at discrete points. And usually there's a lot of big gaps. So even though some applications, FIMAN and others, use things like inundation libraries, again, they're usually concentrated and they have model specific stuff that you have to do to make those work. And then there's still big gaps between. So those are some of the challenges we're trying to address. Next slide. So overall, as I just mentioned, we were trying to come up with a way to provide seamless storm event mapping throughout the county. Anytime there's a rain event and it triggers one of these low-cost gauges or USGS gauges. And so we have the two kind of two parallel interests, this stuff happening in real time, and then as the Davids mentioned, develop the maximum inundation following the event, so you could kind of see how to react to that. Next slide. So the solution, this is still in development, so that's why I put solution or solutions is, it's essentially what makes this work, and I'll show you hopefully how this works so quickly, is we're integrating all this sensor gauge stuff, and then we're integrating that with all the detailed flood hazard information that the county has already developed. So we're not doing any new hydraulic modeling for any part of what I'm going to talk about. And overall, everyone has the same uniform goal. We're trying to enhance the storm event response, recovery, and program planning in the long term. Next slide. So I think David Creighton already touched on this, but the reason why, Mecklenburg County is such a good case is, if you've got basically all the building blocks in place. You have detailed models with, for all the streams in the county. There's over 300 miles of them. We have great LiDAR, 8 points per meter in most cases. They already have a dense gauge network and have densified that further with the sensors. And on the risk vulnerability data, the RAR framework. So the other caveat I think that really probably made this project particularly interested to DHS was trying to solve the challenge of real-time assessments in urbanized areas. Has always been tricky because it's flash flood. So if you may or may not know that there are no forecast gauges in Mecklenburg County, even though there's a lot of gauges. And what they've said is they just can't. It's hard to predict things, or hard to when you have such flashy systems. So kind of like the motto is, if we can get it to work here, the same logic can be applied anywhere. Next slide. So I'm going to touch on some of the building blocks. There's again the three pieces. There's the flood data, the risk data, and then the gauges and sensors. So on the flood data, Dave Creighton already alluded to, we have lots of detailed hydrologic and hydraulic models that have this wide range, which go beyond the standard FEMA, but is becoming more and more commonplace in FEMA studies. So these are the FEMA streams, not the smaller ditches and things that drain less than a square mile. So we've already got this great network of hydrologic and hydraulic models that have the culverts, the bridges, the topo, all that good stuff. So when the water hits the ground and is going through the system, it sees all the the various components that affect it. Another thing that Mecklenburg County also has, which is become more prevalent in the FEMA world as well, as these enhanced flood risk data sets, or flood risk products. They're not regulatory. So for some FEMA studies, in fact, most things in North and South Carolina, they're producing these as kind of a separate path. They don't regulate to them, but they're producing many of these things I'm going to talk about. These include inundation boundaries, water surface elevation rasters. So raster is just basically you kind of break the ground into I guess cells, usually 10 by 10 or 20 by 20, and so you have like a continuous surface. And so we have these in Mecklenburg County that was done as part of all the FEMA modeling already for all 7 events. And there's one product in particular that supports this, or really makes this work quickly, and that's called a probability raster, or a percent annual chance. And David Creighton kind of alluded to that earlier in the talk about trying to figure out when does, not only is the 100-year or the 10-year, but at what point does a cell of land get wet? On the risk and vulnerability side, we have the RAR framework. So again, what that is essentially an inventory of all the buildings in and near the floodplains. I think there's nearly 6,000 that are concluded, and so we've conflated a ton of data. So it has all these, elevation certificate information, parcel information, value information, location information, and you couple that with the tools that they've been using to kind of guide their program, the RAR tools, and that lets you dynamically assess and risk and evaluate mitigation strategies at the building level. So the reason why we need a tool for that is, as floodplains change, or as buildings here in Mecklenburg County, there's been a lot of redevelopment, infill development. So on a regular basis, as things change, you can just push in new data and rerun the tools. Next slide. So these are just some examples. The things you saw at the right is part of the RAR dashboard, and so on one button click for a building, and I'm not going to go through any of those, but there's like 4 screens of data attached to every building. The risk data, the mitigation data, it has cost, benefit cost ratios, so forth. The stuff on the left is kind of some of the flood hazard products, models, depth grids, pictures of the PAC grid. Next slide. So going in a little bit more in this PAC, or percent annual chance, it basically, the beauty of this is it's a raster or cell-based product that provides the percent chance of any given cell when it will be flooded. And so really the way it figures that out is it takes that library of the 7 storm events that we have, and then overlays that with the ground surface, which also is very detailed from the LiDAR, And it's basically a mathematical calculation to say at what point, based on these known water surface elevations, would this cell get wet. So one beauty of it, it's not real-time model, but it's modeled back. So if you have culverts or embankments or anything else that back water up, that's going to be reflected in the PAC. So it leverages the benefits of the model that sees everything and kind of consolidates everything into a nice, neat little package. And with this product, you can produce inundation boundaries for basically any event within the range. And I suppose if you wanted to extrapolate outside the range, you could do that. Next slide. So I had to have our in-house expert, David Key, on the PowerPoint graphics to try to help me out. But so here's a kind of a representation. If you chop the ground into all these cells, and so we know the ground elevation, and we know the 7 water surface elevations at each point. So we kind of interpolate like at what elevation or what recurrence would a cell get wet. Next slide. So here's kind of what a PAC, this is one in Mecklenburg County, the one at the left. So what it gives you is you can point and click anywhere within this raster or this data set, and it returns the percent annual chance that cell is going to get wet. So if the storm event that you have is that percent or less, or has a return a recurrence interval greater or than that, it's saying, hey, that cell is going to get wet. So like, I don't know if you can see, but I'm clicking kind of near a house, and even though it's surrounded by dark colors, which mean it gets flooded more often, it's saying that's high enough that it would take a 160 or 7-year storm or 0.6% event to get that wet. Coming somewhat from the FEMA world, there's always, someone that wants to be smart and ask, if here's the 100-year floodplain, what about the 87-year floodplain or the 63-year floodplain or whatever else? With this product, you can basically generate that on the fly, and you can quiet your critics quickly. So, here's an example where you're basically just filtering cells in your raster. So the middle one, as it says, the 18-year storm, and then the 72-year storm kind of superimposed with that. Next slide. This was covered quite a bit. So there's basically the essence is we want to leverage all the combination of the USGS gauges and the low-cost sensors for this project. So one of the first things we did early on was try to just evaluate which ones were viable to use. And overall, we have I think 106 that are credible, that we have all the data needed to support. Next slide. Go ahead. Next one. So in the data coverage, James kind of alluded to this overall, but just to give a perspective, so Mecklenburg County has 113 FEMA map streams, various lengths. They total about 360 miles. The 5,900 buildings, these are the buildings that are evaluated in RAR, and so we have all this building level risk scores and details. So with all the gauges in place, even though that first number is a relatively small percentage-wise as far as streams, that's because there's a lot of smaller segment streams where there's no risk. So we're getting about 65% of the stream mileages we can cover, with the current gauge sensor network. But more importantly, when you take the cumulative risk and identify where it is in the county, the current setup is covering about 95% of the total risk, and that was by design. I mean, that's, as they was alluded to earlier, that was part of the logic of where to put the gauges. Next slide. So here's a workflow. Again, we have sort of 2 paths, the real-time path. And I'll go through these in a little bit more detail, but what we're trying to do is we're trying to get stuff, as Josh mentioned, the gauges report every 5 to 10 minutes. We're trying to go get that data, fetch data from the API, process it, and produce an inundation boundary. And the second path is, the day after the storm event, David or James or someone goes in and says, I want to look back at that storm event. So they'll say, give me the last 24 hours of data, or 48 hours, or whatever the event is. Same thing, you'll go get the data, do some more processing, map it, and then the second part of the step is then run it through to get a risk profile, losses avoided, and you can have all sorts of reporting and program functions. Next slide. On the data extraction processing, I saw maybe there may have been some questions. So the way we're accessing the data is they opened it up to the APIs. So we have some application programmers. We're using Python to initiate API calls. It comes in as an XML. Those of you who've worked with APIs, the USGS comes in as JSON. So you can go and call out the 106 gauges. You pull it in. We're using Python modules to parse it out, and then we're putting it into a database so we can access it. And then expose it to our geoprocessing tools that do the mapping. For the real-time stuff, we can hook that up to a scheduler just to run. So like when we had an event, although it turned out it wasn't as big of an event as we were expecting, but a few weeks ago when they were saying we might get as much as 10 inches, we turned on the scheduler, and this is in testing mode, and we had it running. So it was collecting data every 5 minutes. Next slide. So once we get that data and put it into a database, then really the beauty of it is the simplicity of it is, we are going to generate a flood inundation boundary. And so I have the kind of the general workflow ties into what David Craning was talking to, is we're kind of focused, since the creek changes and there's backwater and everything, the elevation, we can't directly interpolate elevation between these gauges, but we believe the recurrence interval, since we have such a dense network, and we believe that the recurrence interval is a much more uniform, and I guess it's less likely to change dramatically up and down throughout the creek. We're basically interpolating that. So we're building these surfaces. We're identifying, we're pulling in the readings, calculating the recurrence interval, developing these surfaces, integrating that with the PAC to come up with a boundary. Next slide, please. So here's kind of a visual representation of that. And this is just made up data. So pretend the storm is happening. So in dry conditions like right now, even though the stream sensors are reporting, they're not at a mappable level. So they'll just, even if we had the rover running or the scheduler running, it would just, the first thing it does is says, hey, is this elevation that the gauge is reporting mappable or not? And if it is, so in this hypothetical scenario, something is reporting, we run the calculation to estimate the recurrence interval. We develop a surface, that's the top right of a recurrence interval along the stream corridors, and then we overlay that with our PAC grid. Next slide. So what's produced from that is these inundation boundaries. So you're kind of overlaying multiple 3D surfaces to make this happen. But you can see is the one at the left, which is more zoomed out, the one at the right more zoomed in. Since this is leveraging all that great LiDAR model data, the boundaries it creates, and this is with no extra cleaning, so the boundaries it creates are pretty good. Next slide. So one thing that was, I guess we were nervous about initially, it was like, we don't necessarily, I don't know if during the storm event, if the gauges are reading every 3 minutes, trying to make everything happen in 3 minutes, I think we can live with less than that, but we certainly didn't want this process to be taking, hours or half of it, as James alluded to, many times these peaks come and go. So we don't want to be showing data 2 hours ago that's, totally not reflecting what's out there. So happy to say our initial testing has been very good. We were able to run the mapping, so we have about 230 miles of streams in the entire county. So in the real-time processes, we can go from, this is soup to nuts, where we're going out. So the way we tested this, we actually said, okay, go out and get real data from the Contrail API. Since it's not flooding, we just randomly added 10 feet to it or 12 feet to it, just so it would produce mapping, run all the calculations and map it. And we're doing that entire process in just a few minutes. And the post-event takes a little bit longer because it's having to go through and calculate maximums and so forth. But again, this is a very fast process. Next slide. So since we haven't, I thought this weekend there was a lot of rain, but it kind of rained slowly, so things weren't flashing this weekend either. But so we wanted to kind of test it on a real event, even so one of the big events of memory in Mecklenburg County was August 2008. So of course, this is a long time before the low-cost sensors were installed, but we still had the USGS gauges, and the county had gone out and collected high water marks, nearly 400 of them. In fact, ESP assisted with that along 34 streams. So we sort of, I guess, hardwired some of the logic that we use for this separate process called the losses avoided with our new mapping algorithms to retroactively map this. And we basically replaced high watermarks or aggregated high watermarks in place of the sensors. So, I mean, again, the performance was really quick. We were able to run the entire event in less than a minute. Next slide. And I know I'm getting close to the end, so here's what the mapping looks like. You can see the whole county. So this was all produced in about a minute. The one at the right is kind of a zoom in. All the blue triangles are individual high watermarks where data was collected. So, I mean, one of the other benefits of the sensors, and I think one of the folks alluded to it, is, if you have enough sensors, even though they cost a couple $1,000s, it's a whole lot cheaper than having to send out, people after event and go to houses and, measure. I mean, you might still want to validate it, but you get a huge cost savings and maybe do your high watermark collection just more as a strategic validation. Next slide. So here's what a water surface elevation product looks like. So, the water, again, the elevation water flows downhill, so it's going to be higher and it goes lower as the stream. But the beauty or the magic of the water surface elevation is that gives you an actual height NAVD. And then we have all this great building data and infrastructure data. We can compare the water elevation with the finished floor, the mechanical elevation, the lag. So all these things that the RAR tool runs and considers, and our losses avoided tool runs, we can quickly integrate that data. On the right is just an example of a depth grid. So that's the depth above ground. So it provides kind of a powerful visualization. Next step, or next slide. So again, during the analysis, there's the two things. There's the automated approach. So every 5 to 10 minutes, we can produce this boundary. So the way the public would see this, or the county would be, that the plan is we'll publish these out as we set up map feature services or map services, and we'll publish to a REST service, and that will be consumed by fins. So it'll be viewable, and as the tool updates, it will just update the map service. On the post-storm event analysis, that will take some desktop tools. So they'll go in, they'll give it a date range, they'll pull that, it'll calculate the maximums, and then generate these boundaries and water surface elevations, depth rasters, run it through all the risk metrics in RAR and the losses avoided. So not only can they see what was flooded, but as others have alluded to, I mean, they're trying to show a return on investment on their mitigation. So we also have data for what the buildings were before they were bought out or mitigated. So we could say this storm would have caused this much damage. And so that we can track, we'll have all this in an enterprise database. So, things will be cataloged and we can see the full picture moving forward. Next slide. So kind of where we're at, we've compiled all the data we have. We've been focused on the mechanics, just trying to make sure that we can work this logic out, and it's appropriately fast. So I'm happy to say that it is. We do have a lot of cleanup as far as just refining the tools and the processes, and to make them ready for prime time. So that the next steps are refining the tools, the database frameworks to make all this happen, so we can deliver to the county. Integrate the RAR and the LAT is the losses avoided tool logic into the post-event analysis. One other thing we're going to try to do, we haven't really talked on the predictive side much, but as Josh mentioned, there's just a lot of existing rainfall gauges and rainfall measurements on these sensors as well. So we were going to look into see if there's a way to add some level of component of, even though this is urban and it's kind of flashy, add some level of a predictive element to this as well. And I think with that, I'll turn it back over to David Craning for some final thoughts.
Thanks, Neil. In closing, we'll just point out that, as I said in the beginning, this is a very close partnership with Department of Homeland Security, Science and Technology Directorate, where we're developing this framework. to produce real-time storm event flood inundation maps from the low-cost sensors. And these low-cost sensors will allow us to better protect our community and understand what's going on during flood events and help us to better recover. With that, I'll thank all the presenters. At the end of this presentation, as you can see, all of our email addresses. If you want to contact any of us directly, we're more than happy to answer your questions if we can. And with that, I will turn it over to Regina. Do we have any questions, Regina, or is there any additional information we can provide?
Right. Well, at this point, great job with the presentations. Thanks so much to our presenters. We really appreciate your time and this meaningful information that you've been able to share. We hope it can make a difference in many communities and help you to continue to make that linkage and flood control. The Regional Stormwater Partnership of the Carolinas would like to thank everybody for attending. And we do have a little bit of information I just sent through on the chat where we have, if you did want professional engineering PDH hours, please submit the form that was attached to your email with a link to me, and I will get your certificate to you after confirming with Zoom that you were present during the presentations. If there's any questions right now, well, it looks like we've got 2 questions that maybe came up, so we can look at those, but we'll officially close the meeting at 11 since it closed, but our panelists were available for a few more questions, and we do have 2 questions if our panelists will continue to join us. And I wanted to turn the time over to Chris for a minute, the chairman of the Regional Stormwater Partnership. Chris?
Yes, like Regina said, if you want to get your PDHs, send those to her attention. Her email address is in the panelist box there. Any information, you want to get information about the Regional Stormwater Partnership, you can go to our webpage, which is regionalstormwater.org. And I say also thank all the panel members for presenting today. I think we got a tech talk coming up again in December. Is that right?
Right. We're going to have a workshop in December in which we're going to look at some of those stormwater control measures and HOAs and how to manage those. So we'll get more information to those folks that have registered to attend. We'll send you the information on that as it continues to evolve. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, so keep a lookout for all that. We plan on at least trying to have a couple tech talks a year. So I think that's everything I've got.
Wonderful. Thanks, Chris. For our panel, we just had someone that said thanks in advance for the presentations, and the PowerPoint slides will be presented on the regionalstormwater.org website. Give us a week or so, we'll get them up there, and look forward to you accessing those and helping to train others and learning more about this and following up with our presenters. Thanks to everybody. And bye-bye.